piercing alarms signaled a dead flatline. In 5 brutal minutes, a rookie nurse did what 3 seasoned trauma surgeons couldn't, pulling a legendary Navy SEAL back from the edge of the abyss. But her miracle wasn't a blessing. By sunrise, she wasn't a hero. She was the FBI's most wanted fugitive. The storm outside Providence Memorial Hospital in Anchorage, Alaska, was unforgiving. But it was nothing compared to the tempest about to breach the emergency room doors. It was 2:14 a.m. on a relentless Tuesday in October. Abigail Preston, 3 weeks into her tenure as a trauma nurse, was wiping down bay for her scrubs, already smelling faintly of bleach and stale coffee. She was 24, armed with a brilliant detail-oriented mind, but still possessed the nervous energy of someone who had never seen a man truly torn apart. That was about to change. There were no sirens, no radio calls from dispatch, just the violent explosive shattering of the ER's automatic glass doors as they were forced open by 3 men in unmarked pitch-black tactical gear. Between them, they carried a 4th man. He was massive, built like a fortress, but currently crumbling like ruins. His tactical vest was soaked in a horrifying volume of dark arterial blood. "We need a trauma surgeon. Now!" The lead operative roared, his voice cutting through the hum of the hospital like a serrated blade. He didn't look like a paramedic. He looked like a man who killed for a living. And right now his eyes were wide with genuine terror. Dr. Benjamin Carter, the senior attending on the night shift, sprinted out of the break room, his half-eaten sandwich abandoned. "Get him on the bed. What do we have? Gunshot wound to the right upper thorax. But that's not the problem," the operative barked, shoving a terrified orderly out of the way. "He caught a piece of high-velocity shrapnel to the neck. We couldn't stop the bleeding in the chopper." Abigail rushed to the bedside, her gloved hands trembling only slightly as she helped transfer the patient. The man's dog tag slipped from beneath his blood-soaked undershirt. Brooks Wyatt. O positive. "All right. Let's get 2 large-bore IVs started. Push normal saline. Get me O negative from the cooler." Dr. Carter shouted, his hands already hovering over the catastrophic wound on Wyatt's neck. The blood was pulsing rhythmically, an arterial bleed. The next 3 minutes were a blur of organized chaos. Nurses and technicians swarmed the bed. Abigail moved with frantic precision, securing the IV lines and hanging the fluid bags. But as she watched the monitor, her stomach plummeted. Wyatt's blood pressure was tanking. 60/40, 50/30. The alarms began to shriek, a high-pitched mechanical wail that signaled impending death. "I can't clamp the artery. The tissue is too shredded." Dr. Carter panicked, his fingers slipping in the crimson pool. "He's bleeding out faster than we can pump it in. Where is the general surgeon?" 10 minutes out, head nurse Evelyn Hayes yelled over the noise. 10 minutes, Abigail thought. He doesn't have 10 seconds. She looked down at Wyatt Brooks. His skin was the color of wet ash. His lips were blue. And then his eyes snapped open. They were a piercing, stormy gray, and despite the fact that his body was shutting down, they were entirely lucid. He looked directly at Abigail, not at Dr. Carter, not at his team, at her. In that fraction of a second, his massive blood-slicked hand shot out with terrifying speed and gripped Abigail's wrist. His grip was like a vice bruising her skin. He pulled her down slightly, his lips moving silently. Then the heart monitor flatlined, a solid, piercing tone. "He's crashing, starting compressions," Dr. Carter yelled. "Wait!" Abigail screamed, her voice tearing through the room with such authority that everyone, including the Black Ops soldiers, froze. She hadn't just seen his eyes. While leaning in the bright surgical lights had illuminated the side of his neck at a different angle. Dr. Carter was hyper-focused on the visible laceration, but Abigail saw the subtle, terrifying swelling at the base of his throat, right above the clavicle. The windpipe was shifted slightly to the left. "It's not just the artery," Abigail said, rapidly shoving her way past Dr. Carter. "He's got a tension pneumothorax, but it's tracking backward. The shrapnel didn't just nick the artery, it punctured the apex of the lung and trapped air in the deep cervical fascia. The pressure is collapsing his vena cava. Compressions won't work. There's no blood returning to the heart." "Preston, step back, you're a nurse," Dr. Carter shouted. "If you press on his chest, he dies right now," Abigail snapped, grabbing a 14-gauge needle from the crash cart. Before Carter could physically stop her, she drove the needle into the second intercostal space on Wyatt's right chest, instantly venting a massive rush of trapped air with a loud hiss. Simultaneously, she didn't bother trying to clamp the shredded artery. She took a trauma dressing, balled it up, and shoved her fist directly into the wound channel, pressing her knuckles hard against the cervical spine, completely occluding the vessel with sheer brute physical force. "Push 1 milligram of epinephrine now," she ordered the senior nurse, Evelyn. Evelyn, stunned by the rookie's command, obeyed instinctively. 5 seconds passed. 10. The flatline continued to scream. Abigail poured all her upper body weight onto her fist, praying her anatomical instinct was right. Suddenly, the monitor beeped. Once, twice. Then an erratic jumping rhythm established itself. Beep, beep, beep. His heart had restarted. The pressure off his major vessels allowed the blood to circulate again. The lead operative stared at Abigail, his jaw tight. Dr. Carter stood frozen, his hands empty. "He's back!" Abigail breathed, her arms shaking from the exertion. "I have the artery compressed against the bone. Get the vascular surgeon down here immediately. I'm not moving my hand until they are ready to stitch." In exactly 5 minutes, a 24-year-old nurse had hijacked a trauma code and ripped a Navy SEAL from the jaws of certain death. But as the adrenaline began to recede, Abigail felt something cold and hard in the pocket of her scrubs. A heavy metallic weight that hadn't been there when her shift started. She remembered Wyatt grabbing her wrist. He hadn't just been reaching out in pain. He had dropped something inside her pocket. For the next 2 hours, Abigail didn't move. She stood hunched over the operating table, her fist buried in Wyatt Brooks's neck, acting as a human tourniquet, until the vascular surgeon painstakingly repaired the shredded artery. When she finally stepped back, her hands were cramping so violently she could barely uncurl her fingers. "Incredible work, Preston," the surgeon murmured, adjusting his loopies. "You bought him a tomorrow. Go wash up." Abigail nodded numbly, stumbling out of the OR and down the sterile, brightly lit corridor toward the locker room. The hospital felt entirely different now. The normal hum of Providence Memorial had been suffocated by a heavy, suffocating tension. Tactical men in civilian clothes stood at the end of the hallways. They weren't local police. They weren't military police. They wore no insignias, and they watched her with cold, calculating eyes as she walked past. She reached the locker room, pushed the door closed, and locked it. The silence of the tiled room was deafening. Leaning against the sink, she turned on the hot water and watched the crimson swirl down the drain. Only then did she reach into her pocket. Her fingers brushed against cold metal. She pulled it out and held it under the fluorescent light. It was a heavy titanium flash drive, roughly the size of a lighter. It was custom-made, etched with a series of alphanumeric codes, and smeared with Wyatt Brooks's blood. Attached to it was a tiny biometric fingerprint scanner. Abigail's breath hitched. Why me, she thought. I'm nobody. Why did he give this to me? A sudden sharp knock at the locker room door made her jump, nearly dropping the drive into the sink. She quickly shoved it deep into her bra against her skin and grabbed a paper towel. "Yeah, just a minute," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. She unlocked the door. Standing there was a man she hadn't seen in the ER. He was tall, dressed in a sharp black suit that screamed government issue, with a face so devoid of expression it looked carved from stone. "Nurse Preston," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am Commander Reed. I need to ask you a few questions about the patient you just treated." "He's in the ICU," Abigail said, clutching the wet paper towel. "Dr. Carter is the attending." "I am not interested in Dr. Carter." Reed interrupted, smoothly stepping into the locker room, a clear violation of hospital protocol. He closed the door behind him. "I am interested in those 5 minutes you spent over him. Commander Brooks was in a highly compromised state. Delirious. Did he say anything to you? Hand you anything?" The hairs on the back of Abigail's neck stood up. Reed's eyes weren't just probing. They were predatory. He wasn't worried about Wyatt's health. He was worried about what Wyatt knew. "He didn't say anything?" Abigail lied smoothly, relying on the genuine exhaustion on her face to sell the performance. "He was in cardiac arrest, Commander. People without a pulse tend to be pretty quiet." Reed stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. His eyes dropped to her pockets, then back to her face. "You did a very brave thing tonight, nurse. But sometimes bravery gets in the way of inevitability. If you remember anything, you will come to me." He handed her a blank white card with a single phone number on it, turned and left. Abigail waited until his footsteps faded before letting out a shaky breath. The hospital was compromised. The men guarding Wyatt weren't his brothers in arms. They were his captors. Or worse, his executioners. She had to check on him. By 4:30 a.m., the ICU was dimly lit, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, creating a deceptive sense of peace. 2 of the tactical men stood outside Wyatt's room. Abigail grabbed a chart put on her most bored professional face and walked right past them. "Checking his vitals," she muttered. The guards exchanged a look, but let her pass. Inside the room was shrouded in shadows. Wyatt Brooks looked pale against the white sheets, a web of tubes keeping him tethered to the world. Abigail approached the bed, checking the IV drip. Suddenly, the heart monitor spiked. Wyatt's hand shot out weaker this time, but still desperate, and grabbed her forearm. Abigail gasped, nearly dropping her clipboard. Wyatt's eyes were open glassy with painkillers and fever, but burning with an intense, terrifying urgency. He pulled the oxygen mask down just enough to speak. His voice was a wet, agonizing rasp. "The drive," he breathed. "I have it," Abigail whispered back, terrified the men outside would hear. "I have it. Who are these guys I need to call the police?" "No police." Wyatt choked out, his grip tightening. "They own the police. Reed. Reed is the leak. The drive. Has the names. All the assets. They sold out. He coughed a terrible sound that rattled in his chest. "They poisoned my unit, framed it as an ambush. They let me bleed out so I couldn't report it." Abigail's blood ran cold. "Why did you give it to me?" "Because you were the only one trying to save me," he whispered, his eyes locking onto hers. "They are going to finish it. Tonight, you need to run. If they find it on you, you're a dead woman." Before Abigail could respond, the door handle clicked. Wyatt immediately dropped his hand and let his eyes roll back, feigning unconsciousness. Abigail quickly adjusted his blanket, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Commander Reed stepped into the room. He looked at the monitor, then at Abigail. "Is there a problem, Nurse?" Reed asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. "No," Abigail said, her voice remarkably steady, despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Just adjusting his fentanyl drip. He was getting restless." "Leave," Reed commanded softly. "My men will monitor him from here. No hospital staff is permitted in this room until morning. He needs medical observation." "I said leave, Nurse Preston." Reed's hand rested casually over the right side of his jacket, over a holster. Abigail swallowed hard, nodded, and walked out. As the door swung shut, she caught a glimpse of Reed moving toward the IV bag, pulling a small, unlabeled syringe from his pocket. He was going to kill him. Right now. Without thinking, Abigail didn't walk back to the nurse's station. She ducked into the adjoining supply closet. There was a small observation window connecting it to the ICU room, obscured by boxes of gauze. She peered through the crack. Reed injected the clear liquid into Wyatt's IV line, waited for a moment, and then quietly exited the room, signaling his men to stand down. Abigail burst out of the closet the second the hallway was clear, sprinting back into the room. She didn't have time to think. She grabbed the contaminated IV bag and ripped the line out of Wyatt's arm, tossing it into the biohazard bin. She frantically hooked up a fresh bag of saline and flushed his secondary line. She checked his pupils. They were dilated, but he was breathing. She had stopped the lethal dose from reaching his heart by seconds. But as she stood there holding the empty syringe, she had knocked out of Reed's hand. A horrifying realization washed over her. Reed didn't just try to kill Wyatt. He had just ensured there would be a body, and Abigail Preston was the last medical professional documented in the room. He had used her system login on the smart pump when she briefly logged in earlier. He wasn't just assassinating a Navy SEAL. He was framing her for it. By 5:45 a.m., the storm had broken, leaving Anchorage painted in a cold, slate-gray dawn. Abigail was in the staff locker room, her shift technically over at 6 o'clock. She was hyperventilating, staring at the burner phone she kept for emergencies, trying to decide who to call. The police, Wyatt said they were compromised. The media. She had no proof, just a bloody flash drive she couldn't open. She needed to get out of the hospital. She needed to vanish, figure out what was on the drive, and find someone who could help her. She quickly changed out of her scrubs, throwing on a heavy dark parka and jeans. She packed her backpack with gauze medical tape, a few stolen syringes of epinephrine, and her wallet. Just as she zipped her bag, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Evelyn Hayes, the head nurse. "Abby, do not go to the lobby. Heavily armed federal agents just locked down the building. They are asking for you by name." Abigail's blood turned to ice. They weren't wasting any time. Reed's plan was in motion. If she was caught now, she would be paraded in front of cameras as a foreign operative who infiltrated a hospital to assassinate an American hero. She would disappear into a black site, or she would be found dead in a cell, an apparent suicide. She cracked the locker room door open. Down the hall, she saw them. Not the unmarked tactical men from the night before, but official FBI SWAT. Dozens of them. Helmed by a man with silver hair and a hardened face, Special Agent Mitchell Graham. "We want all exits sealed. Nobody leaves, nobody enters," Graham's voice echoed down the corridor. "Suspect is Abigail Preston, 24. Considered armed, highly dangerous, and a flight risk. She is wanted for the attempted murder of a United States naval officer. Shoot on sight if she resists." Shoot on sight. They had fabricated an entire history for her overnight. Abigail backed away from the door, her breathing shallow. The front doors were blocked. The ER bay was swarming. The roof was a dead end. She looked at the laundry chute. It was a dangerous, archaic drop system, designed for soiled linens, leading straight down to the sub-basement incinerator and loading docks. It was a 4-story drop. If the cart at the bottom wasn't full, she would break her legs. Footsteps thundered down the hall. "Check the locker rooms, tear them apart," Graham shouted, getting closer. Abigail grabbed the heavy metal latch of the chute and hauled it open. The smell of bleach and old blood wafted up. It was pitch black. "In here," a voice yelled from the hallway. The locker room door began to rattle. Abigail swung her legs over the edge, grabbed the rim with both hands, and let go. She plummeted into the darkness, the metal walls rushing past her in a terrifying blur. She braced herself, squeezing her eyes shut. She hit the bottom with a violent, suffocating thud, sinking deep into a mountain of soiled, damp hospital linens. The impact knocked the wind out of her, but nothing cracked. She scrambled out of the cart, gasping for air, her clothes covered in God knew what. She was in the sub-basement. The loading dock doors were 50 feet away. Through the frosted glass, she could see the flashing red and blue lights of dozens of police cruisers. She couldn't use the doors. She scanned the dim concrete basement. To her left was a heavy steel door marked morgue/ancillary tunnels. Anchorage had a network of old Utilidor's underground heating tunnels built in the 1970s that connected the hospital to the university across the street. Abigail ran to the door, swiped her hospital ID badge, and prayed they hadn't deactivated it yet. A green light flashed. The door clicked open. As she slipped inside and locked the heavy deadbolt behind her, she heard the loading dock doors crash open above. Dogs were barking. Radios were crackling. The hunt had officially begun. Abigail Preston ran into the suffocating darkness of the tunnels, the titanium drive, burning a cold hole against her skin. 12 hours ago, her biggest worry was paying her student loans and memorizing drug interactions. Now she held the highest level state secrets in her bra. The FBI was hunting her with shoot-to-kill orders, and the only person who knew she was innocent was a Navy SEAL lying in a coma. She didn't just have to survive. She had to fight back. The Utilidors beneath Providence Memorial Hospital were a subterranean nightmare. Built in the 1970s to circulate steam heating between the hospital and the neighboring university campus, the concrete tunnels were suffocatingly hot, smelling of rust, stagnant water, and decaying vermin. Abigail Preston ran blindly through the oppressive gloom, the solitary beam of her smartphone flashlight, cutting through the thick clouds of venting steam. Every drip of water sounded like a boot step. Every groan of the pipes echoed like a distant shout. Above her, muffled by tons of concrete, she could hear the faint, terrifying wail of police sirens converging on the hospital she had just fled. She had 20 minutes before the FBI tactical units realized she hadn't slipped out the loading docks and discovered the heavy steel door she had locked behind her. Abigail forced herself to slow down her lungs, burning her scrubs soaked with sweat and the lingering metallic stench of Wyatt Brooks's blood. She needed a safe harbor, a place with a secure internet connection where she could figure out what the dying Navy SEAL had given her. She couldn't go to her apartment. They would already be there, tearing her life apart, freezing her bank accounts, painting her as a radicalized lone wolf. She had to stay off the grid. A mile into the tunnel network, she reached a rusted iron ladder that led up to a heavy maintenance grate. According to the faded map painted on the concrete wall, this shaft opened into the basement of the Anchorage University Science and Engineering building. She climbed the ladder, ignoring the burning cramps in her thighs, and pushed against the grate. It was heavy sealed by years of grime, but pure adrenaline fueled her muscles. With a desperate heave, the grate popped open, clattering loudly against a tiled floor. Abigail hauled herself up into a deserted janitorial closet. It was 6:30 a.m. The campus was largely empty, save for the earliest students and faculty. She slipped out of the closet, pulling her dark parka tightly around her to hide her soiled scrubs. She kept her head down, avoiding the security cameras mounted in the hallways, her medical knowledge serving her well. She walked with a deliberate, steady limp to alter her natural gait, throwing off any facial recognition software analyzing body mechanics. She needed to find someone who understood high-level encryption, someone who hated the government enough to not ask questions. She remembered Evelyn Hayes, her head nurse, constantly complaining about her brilliant but deeply paranoid nephew, a graduate student who practically lived in the university's cybersecurity lab. His name was Simon. Abigail navigated the labyrinthine hallways until she found the basement server farm. The door was locked with a digital keypad. She knocked a frantic, erratic rhythm against the heavy security glass. For a terrifying minute, nothing happened. Then the door hissed open, revealing a tall, gaunt young man with dark circles under his eyes, wearing a faded band t-shirt. He looked at Abigail, his eyes widening as he took in her pale face and the bloodstains on her shoes. Simon Hayes. Abigail asked, her voice cracking. "Evelyn sent me." It was a lie, but she needed leverage. Simon pulled her inside and slammed the door, engaging 3 separate deadbolts. The room was freezing, filled with the deafening hum of cooling fans and racks of blinking servers. "Aunt Evie didn't send you," Simon said, his voice a low, nervous whisper. "Every scanner on the police band is screaming your name. They're calling you an assassin. They say you tried to kill a federal asset. They're framing me," Abigail said, reaching into her parka. She pulled out the titanium flash drive. "The asset they say I tried to kill. He gave me this. The men who brought him to the hospital are the ones who want him dead. I need to know what's on this drive, Simon. If I don't get this data out, I am going to die today, and so is he." Simon stared at the drive, his professional curiosity battling his intense fear. The titanium casing, the lack of a brand logo, the biometric scanner, it was military-grade hardware. The kind of thing that didn't just ruin lives, it ended them. "If I plug that into my network, the NSA, we will trace the handshake in 3 seconds, Simon muttered, backing away. "Then don't plug it into the network." Abigail snapped, her patience evaporating. "Air gap a laptop. Disconnect it from the internet. Just open the files. Please, Simon, you're the only person I can trust. Reluctantly, Simon pulled a battered, heavy laptop from a locked drawer. He disabled the Wi-Fi card, physically snipping the wire with wire cutters. He booted it up on a completely isolated, encrypted operating system. Give it to me. Abigail handed him the drive. As he inserted it into the USB port, a red light on the biometric scanner blinked to life. A prompt appeared on the black screen: authorization required. Biometric signature or override code. It's locked down, Simon said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. I can't crack AES 256 encryption. It would take a supercomputer 1,000,000 years. We need his thumb, or we need a password. Abigail felt a cold wave of despair wash over her. Wyatt's thumb was miles away, guarded by men who wanted him dead, and he hadn't given her a password. He had only whispered to her in the ICU. The drive has the names. Wait, Abigail said, closing her eyes, forcing her mind back to the chaotic emergency room. She remembered the blood on his chest, the terrible wheeze in his lungs, and the dog tags slipping from his shirt. Brooks Wyatt, O positive. And there was a sequence of numbers stamped below his blood type. Not a social security number, a military ID. Try this, Abigail said, her eyes snapping open. Bravo 749er2 Romeo. Simon typed the sequence into the override field. The red light on the drive flashed yellow, then green. The screen went black for a terrifying second before filling with thousands of lines of text photographs and offshore banking ledgers. Abigail leaned over Simon's shoulder, her eyes scanning the documents. It was a massive, decentralized ledger. What am I looking at? Simon breathed, scrolling through the files. It's a kill list, Abigail whispered, horror gripping her heart. And a payroll. The drive contained detailed dossiers on dozens of covert American intelligence assets operating in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. But more importantly, it contained transaction receipts. Commander Reed and a rogue faction within the intelligence community had systematically sold the identities and locations of these operatives to a foreign syndicate. When Wyatt Brooks's SEAL team had accidentally stumbled upon the money laundering operation during a raid in Syria, Reed had orchestrated a friendly fire ambush to wipe them out. Wyatt was the sole survivor. Reed hadn't brought Wyatt to the hospital to save him. He brought him there to control the narrative, to ensure Wyatt died on an operating table, so Reed could frame the death on his injuries, wiping away the last loose end. There's a secondary file here, Simon said, his voice trembling. He clicked on a video file. The grainy footage showed Commander Reed sitting in a dark room negotiating the price of a CIA station chief's life with a known arms dealer. It was undeniable, irrefutable proof of high treason. We need to send this to the press, Abigail said, her hands shaking. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the director of the FBI, everyone at once. I thought you said if I connect to the internet, they'll track us, Simon argued. They will, Abigail replied, her jaw tightening with newfound resolve. But it will take them exactly 5 minutes to triangulate our location and deploy a team. It takes 1 minute to hit send. We're going to burn Commander Reed to the ground. Simon swallowed hard, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Once I re-engage the connection, there's no going back. We will light up on their grid like a Christmas tree. Do it, Abigail ordered. Simon reached under the desk, plugging a hardwired Ethernet cable directly into the laptop. The connection icon flickered to life. Instantly, Simon ran a script he had pre-written, attaching the decrypted files and the video to a mass email targeting hundreds of verified journalists, senators, and the FBI's Internal Affairs Division. He hit enter. The progress bar appeared, sending 10%, 30%. Suddenly the lights in the server room flickered and died. The hum of the cooling fans ground to a halt. The room was plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the pale glow of the laptop screen. Sending 60%, 80%. A massive concussive boom echoed from the hallway outside. The heavy steel door of the lab shuddered violently. They hadn't triangulated the signal. They were already here. They cut the power to the building. Simon panicked, backing into a corner. How did they find us so fast? Abigail looked at the dark hallway. They didn't track the signal. She realized a cold dread pooling in her stomach. They tracked me. The security cameras in the university hallways. Reed bypassed the FBI. He brought his own men. The heavy door groaned as a shaped charge was placed against the lock, sending 99%. Sent. It's gone, Simon whispered. Hide, Abigail told him, grabbing her backpack. Get under the floorboards. Do not come out no matter what you hear. The laboratory door blew open in a shower of sparks and shattered hinges. 3 men in tactical gear poured into the room, their assault rifles raised, sweeping the darkness with blinding weapon lights. Behind them stepped Commander Reed, his face a mask of cold, calculating fury. He held a suppressed pistol at his side. Search the servers, Reed ordered his men, his eyes locked onto the glowing screen of the laptop. He walked over, glancing at the message sent confirmation box. A muscle feathered in his jaw, but he didn't panic. He simply raised his pistol and shot the laptop twice, shattering the hard drive and the screen. It's too late, Reed, Abigail's voice echoed from the shadows behind the towering server racks. It's already in the inbox of every major news outlet in the country. You're done. Reed signaled his men to fan out. You're a very resourceful nurse, Ms. Preston. I underestimated you. But an email is just an email, a deepfake, a conspiracy theory. Once I put a bullet in your head and leave a manifesto claiming you were a radicalized terrorist, the media will focus on the tragedy, not the data. Abigail moved silently through the dark, narrow aisles between the servers. She was terrified, her heart hammering against her ribs, but the clinical, analytical part of her brain, the part that could stabilize a dying man in 5 minutes, was hyper-focused. She unzipped her backpack. She didn't have a gun. She had medical supplies. She pulled out 2 pre-filled syringes of concentrated epinephrine, the adrenaline used to restart a heart. In the proper dose, it saved lives. In a massive, unchecked dose injected directly into a healthy bloodstream, it caused catastrophic instant cardiac arrest. She also pulled out a roll of heavy medical tape and a sharp trauma shear. You can't hide forever. Abigail. Reed called out, his footsteps echoing on the raised floor tiles. My men are clearing the perimeter. The FBI is still 2 miles away, surrounding the hospital. Nobody is coming to save you. Abigail crouched behind a server rack. One of the tactical men was moving slowly down her aisle. His rifle raised, his flashlight sweeping over the equipment. He was 5 feet away. 3 feet. As the man stepped past her, Abigail lunged from the shadows. She didn't scream. She moved with ruthless efficiency. She drove the trauma shears violently into the unarmored gap at the back of the man's knee, severing his popliteal artery. The man collapsed with a strangled cry, his rifle clattering to the floor. Before he could raise an alarm, Abigail wrapped her arm around his neck, slapping a heavy piece of medical tape over his mouth to muffle his screams. She dragged him silently into the darkness, leaving a trail of blood. "Delta report!" Reed's voice crackled over the radio, clipped to the downed man's vest. Static answered. Abigail picked up the operative's heavy tactical flashlight. She crept to the end of the aisle. The second operative was moving to investigate the noise. Abigail took a deep breath, threw the flashlight down the opposite aisle, and immediately sprinted toward the operative. The man spun toward the clattering flashlight. Abigail slammed into him from behind, driving the first syringe of epinephrine straight through the fabric of his uniform and deep into his trapezius muscle, depressing the plunger instantly. The operative gasped, his eyes going wide as a lethal explosive dose of adrenaline hit his heart. He seized, clutching his chest, and dropped to the floor, his heart vibrating itself to death in massive ventricular fibrillation. "Two down. Clever," Reed's voice came from directly behind her. Abigail froze. She turned slowly. Reed was standing 10 feet away, his suppressed pistol aimed directly at the center of her chest. There was no panic in his eyes, only a cold, professional resignation. "You are exceptionally dangerous, Nurse Preston," Reed said smoothly. "But biology always yields to physics. A bullet travels faster than a syringe." He raised the gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You're right," Abigail said, her voice remarkably calm. She raised her left hand, revealing the second epinephrine syringe. But she didn't point it at Reed. She held it against the side of her own neck, the needle resting perfectly over her jugular vein. But physics yields to leverage. Reed paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "What are you doing?" "I read the files, Reed," Abigail said, stepping backward toward the shattered doorway. "You need a scapegoat. You need me dead to frame me for the assassination of Wyatt Brooks. If you shoot me, there will be an autopsy. The coroner will find the bullet matching the rifling of your weapon. It will prove you were here. It will prove I was murdered." "I can easily alter an autopsy report," Reed scoffed. "Can you?" Abigail challenged, pressing the needle hard enough to draw a bead of blood. With the entire country watching, with the data already in the hands of the FBI. If I push this plunger, my heart stops instantly. No bullets, no entry wounds, just a terrified fugitive who took her own life with medical supplies rather than face capture. But if you shoot me, you leave forensic evidence. Evidence that proves the email they just received is the absolute truth. Reed hesitated. For the first time, a crack of doubt appeared in his stoic facade. He needed the narrative to be clean. A bullet wound complicated the suicide story exponentially, especially with the data leak currently setting Washington on fire. "Put the syringe down, Abigail," Reed said, his voice dropping an octave. "We can negotiate." "I don't negotiate with men who poison their own soldiers," Abigail spat. Suddenly, the wail of sirens outside grew deafening. The screeching of heavy tires echoed through the basement walls. The FBI hadn't stayed at the hospital. The email had reached Special Agent Mitchell Graham. The geolocation data in Simon's email header had given them the exact coordinates of the university lab. Red and blue lights flashed through the high basement windows. Dozens of heavily armed FBI SWAT agents were swarming the building. "Drop your weapon, FBI, drop it now," a voice roared from the hallway. Reed looked toward the door, then back at Abigail. The calculation in his eyes shifted from murder to survival. He lowered his pistol, stepping backward into the shadows of the server room, intending to escape through the maintenance tunnels. "Agent Graham!" Abigail screamed at the top of her lungs, dropping the syringe and diving behind a server rack. "He's in here. Commander Reed is in here." The doorway flooded with tactical lights. Special Agent Graham led the charge, his weapon trained on the darkness. "Reed, drop the weapon and put your hands on your head. We have the drive. It's over." Reed, realizing the perimeter was entirely compromised, slowly stepped out from behind the servers. He dropped his pistol, raising his hands, his face an emotionless mask of defeat. Two agents slammed him against the wall, slapping heavy iron cuffs on his wrists. Graham walked slowly over to Abigail, who was sitting on the floor, her hands shaking violently now that the adrenaline was finally bleeding out of her system. He looked at her soiled scrubs, the blood on her shoes, and the shattered electronics around her. "Abigail Preston." Graham asked, his voice entirely different from the terrifying orders he had barked in the hospital corridors. It was soft, respectful. Abigail nodded slowly. "My director just woke up the Secretary of Defense," Graham said, offering her a hand up. "You just dismantled the largest domestic intelligence trafficking ring in United States history. Are you injured?" "No," Abigail whispered, taking his hand and pulling herself up. She looked at the blood on her scrubs. "But I have a patient I need to check on." 3 days later, the storm had finally passed. The news cycle was dominated by the arrest of Commander Reed and 32 other high-ranking officials implicated in the Brooks leak. Abigail Preston's face was on every television screen, no longer labeled a fugitive, but hailed as a national hero. She walked into the private, heavily guarded recovery room at Providence Memorial. The tactical men in the hallway were gone, replaced by loyal uniformed Navy personnel. Wyatt Brooks was sitting up in bed. His color was better, the horrific wound on his neck expertly bandaged. As Abigail walked in, his stormy gray eyes found hers. The cold, desperate terror she had seen in them 3 nights ago was gone, replaced by a profound, quiet gratitude. "I hear you caused quite a bit of trouble, Nurse Preston." Wyatt said, his voice a raspy whisper, but thick with amusement. "You have terrible bedside manner, Commander Brooks," Abigail replied, a tired but genuine smile breaking across her face. She checked his IV drip, her hands steady, her movements precise. She was a rookie no longer. "Next time you need a blood transfusion, don't try to hand me classified state secrets." Wyatt reached out gently, wrapping his massive hand around her wrist, right where he had grabbed her when he was dying. But this time, his grip was warm, safe, and alive. "There won't be a next time, Abigail," Wyatt promised softly. "Because of you." Abigail looked at the heart monitor. It was strong, steady, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she finally let herself breathe. If you want to know how Abigail uses her medical knowledge to outsmart the FBI decrypt, the drive, and expose Commander Reed in the explosive final chapters, make sure to hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a twist in these thrilling real-life stories. Share this video with a friend who loves medical mysteries and intense spy thrillers. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Abigail's shoes?